recording. Hello, everyone. I realized that the movie for the quiz for week. Oh, excuse me. I got my music on from a silly movie called About Time that I kind of like that my daughter gave me for Christmas. At any rate, there is a video posted. A quiz posted, and this video will be linked eventually as soon as I upload it. And given the way the video is working today, I'll keep my fingers crossed here on campus. At any rate, you have 30 questions. The quiz, as the announcement I sent around indicates, the quiz is located under assignments. The folder for assignments, probably on the left-hand side. If you hit assignments, you'll see that the top one is a week 2. Um, and if you click on there, you'll see, click on the quiz, and then you can take it. You have to finish it at one setting. You're allowed to use the books and everything. And this video will cover the material. You'll get all the questions. You can use your books and things along that way. Now, the quiz is made up of 30, relatively easy if you've read the material and come to class. True, false, and what do we call them? Multiple choice questions. Nothing on here is from the movie that we're watching right now, but one of these times I should put a few in just to make sure everybody has watched it. Now remember from our reading and everything that the first written fairy tales, those are the ones by Charles Perrault in France. France is the home, or what we call the birthplace in many respects, of the literary fairy tale. A lot of stuff was going on in Germany too, but Perrault was in the salons of France, and they weren't developed expressly for children. They were to show off the prowess of the reciter, and there was a certain level of cuteness they called précieux in there. So they were written for adults, and they were written, and Perrault in particular wrote his fairy tales, at least in the beginning, to amuse upper class listeners at these salons in Paris. Salons generally run by very high upper class or aristocratic women. And you see again there that this is a very, very cultured setting, and they aren't the fairy tales that the peasants and many others would listen to in the oral tradition. Now, Perrault did come to, eventually, it comes to be translated into English, and his tales, many of them, are the sort of the bedrock of what we read today. You know, a couple of them, like I said, like Bluebeard, or one of the others, the Juniper Tree, I believe, or Donkey Skin, a couple of these others. They're not read to children anymore. But at any rate, there were, as I've been talking to you about in class, there were very, very important developments, social and political, involved with the creation of the development of the fairy tale, and of course children's literature. And the Industrial Revolution was a big part of it. The Industrial Revolution brought people into the city. It allowed for technical advancements, but also the whole idea of another important development, they're all related, would be the rising literacy of the people, or not only just the rising literacy, but the realization about the importance of literacy for, let's say, getting ahead. And so people wanted things. Now the printing press made it so it was less expensive, and it pushed out things like chapbooks, because now you could write them on more indelible paper, and and get it, and print them for relatively inexpensively, including with color. I mean, the American Revolution really didn't have anything to do with this. The French Revolution did it to the sense that the British didn't want one to happen in England. And so you did have the rise of the municipalities and mayors, and these things are all connected in England, where for us, for English speakers, where we find the development, especially during the first flowering of the children's literature, which takes place during the Victorian tales. Now, not only were fairy tales frowned upon and by the Puritans, which was on the first quiz, as something like pornography, but as we talked about in class, that following the end of World War II, the Allies briefly banned Grimm's fairy tales in Germany. Remember, they were co-opted by the Nazis to uphold the Aryan race somehow. And we talked about this, that the idea that no one nation owns fairy tales, and I mean, these controversies continue. But remember that that the fairy tales are kind of like the universals, the universality of fairy tales. Everybody tells stories, or we might just call them wonder stories. So, but there was this idea that that the Grimm's fairy tales were a reminder, if you will, of the propaganda of Goebbels and everybody during the Second World War. Now, today, as we talked about a number of times, is that for better or for worse, most parents and children, they learn about fairy tales as well as other classics of children's literature by something marketed by Disney. And we'll talk more about this and the problems that surround it. Now, we also have been starting to read fairy tales, and one of them, is one that kind of questions the status quo that we find, and this is one by Oscar Wilde, The Happy Prince. And remember, the Happy Prince was happy while he was alive, and now he's a statue, and comes to the realization of, basically it's political, what we call, I use the word Christian humanism. It has a religious angle to it about ethics and morals, but the prince, who's now a statue, cries, and this is because of the ugliness and misery in the city, which he'd not seen before, and the little sparrow helps him. Now, there are lots of different ways of looking at fairy tales. Of course, you have a longer written tradition that we're finding with people like who was it in Denmark? Hans Christian Andersen, and of course Oscar Wilde. They usually have these pithy short stories, short things. And now we're finding very much like the novel you just started, Skeleton Man, which is not necessarily, it's a tale of wonder, not necessarily a fairy tale. It has elements of the fable in it, with talking animals and things like that, with the sixth grader Molly. So now at 2 we find, and I just started reading another one by the person who wrote Wicked, which is about one of the ugly stepsisters. It's very good. It's not written strictly for children. Things have changed. Now, Ati Arne and Stith Thompson. Stith Thompson is wrote a book called The Universality of Fairy Tales, but they're the ones, they're folklorists, and worked out the numbers that refer to folk tale types I've been talking about, and they are called AT numbers, Ati Thompson. And this is a way that you could, a way to catalog similarities of all these tales, and then it's just a way to organize so that we can talk about variations of 750 Cinderellas and Lord knows how many Red Riding Hoods and others, such as Beauty and the Beast. It's just a way to catalog them. They're called AT numbers. And another person we talked about was Bruno Bettelheim and his book, The Uses of Enchantment, the meaning and importance of fairy tales. Now, he is very important still. I mean, some of the things, as Zipes says, and as I, reiterated in class, that, you know, fairy tales have secret hidden meanings that only children can understand, and very much a product of his time. Bruno Bettelheim always chooses the versions of the fairy tales that uphold the side of 20th century patriarchal, late 1800 patriarchal Germany. uh, and I mean, but he pointed out that fairy tales address all children's psychological conflicts and desires. So, as I said again, something like Cinderella for Bruno Bettelheim would be a story about sibling rivalry, which is important for children. But as I said, that takes the other side. One is the Germans said that they had a national ownership of fairy tales. Well, Bruno Bettelheim is saying, they're like, you shouldn't mess with them, you shouldn't alter them, because in their pristine original versions, that's where the things are for children. Now, of course, that's not true. It's somewhere in the middle. But what he did say remains important, because there are a lot of ways in which fairy tales are used, different versions, of course, for therapy, especially for abused children. They can rewrite their tales, things along those lines. Now, again, when fairy tales became accepted, as fit for children, if you will, to read, when we're starting to see a rise of what we call childhood. You read Beaumont's Beauty and the Beast, and in there, Beauty spends a great deal of her time reading books and cleaning and things along that line. But you do see that she is refined. Um, uh, and she loves everybody, and she's naive and therefore easily manipulated. But we do see that she reads a lot. In fact, that she knows at one point that the beast is not going to really harm her, because he gives her basically a room of her own for reading books. But that's part of what it is to be a good, refined wife. Nothing. Very passive and in support and things like that, but not handling money or any of those things. Now, and then I asked you to read. Didn't go into it in class because you do have extensive notes. That some critics, as I said, you have to, when you're reading the academic criticism, if you dare to, about fairy tales or any of the other things, you have to, you won't agree with everything, or you'll think that's completely out to lunch. But even with Bruno Bettelheim, who I think is just over the top in a lot of ways, nonetheless, I always find there's always something pithy there to recall and remember. So, there's some critics, who say that Little Red Riding Hood is about rape or womb envy, and here they're talking. The one who's writing this would be focusing on the Grimm version, where the man comes and opens the womb, and you're looking at the wolf as a seducer, which goes all the way back to Perrault. We still have the wolf whistle. It's true that they talk about things, and I think that that's pretty much over the top a lot of the times. And yet, if you read these articles, you always find something, a gem in there, because they're smart people. They just don't. Don't have to agree with them. Now, but the other ones, like Zohar Shavit. Zohar Shavit is talking about, and he has a good way of distinguishing between the 100 years, a little bit, yeah, about 100 years between Perrault's versions of something like Little Red Riding Hood and the Grimm's version. Things have changed. But he does point out, as you're talking about, when I was talking about the rise of children's literature, that for centuries, and Shavit points this out, children were seen as miniature men and women. I mean, so everybody heard the same stories and whatnot. And, there was a kind of childhood, but, you started working as soon as you could. It wasn't the way that it turned out to be, let's say, with the birth or the first flowering of children's literature in the Victorian period, where you have the protected child. And we saw Rousseau, for instance, that was on the last quiz, saying, oh, children are born naturally good, so good, don't corrupt them with any books other than Robinson Crusoe, and then only at a certain age. So the miniature men and women, now, up until the 19th century, too, in the same context, that fairy tales and folk tales or tales of wonder were told and read, and as were romances, by the way. That would be stories like King Arthur, by adults, and even among the upper classes. The William Wordsworth and all of them just loved things like were in the chapbooks. They could afford other things, but the stories, they liked the stories. So they heard these by adults, and of course children as well. And there we have it, again, as I said, is according to Zohar Shavi, when we were talking about the difference between Perrault's Cinderella, which is about a naive girl who gets in trouble because she's stupid, and of course she's sort of the blandishment of the sophisticated aristocratic wolf is able to seduce her. And then you have the Grimm's version. And in the Grimm's version, as I said, that violence is used to educate the child to obey, and especially in this case, women. Get in by the time the clock goes off, girls, Cinderella kind of thing, or you're not going to get the prince. So this is the difference between these two, and things have changed. In the fairy tale is now, as Grimm's do the edits, they're making them more and more to what they think is appropriate. I kind of get tired of that word, in the way it says for a child's audience. And because children were the way they were, fairy tales often were quite didactic in the whole idea of teaching a lesson, which, as you're going to find later on, was why fables were used, because fables had a moral. And I talked about Donald Haas, is another the critic, and he's the one that points out that they aren't sacred texts published in heaven, and they're not owned by one nationality. And so Donald Haas says, and this is what I've been calling the stem cells of literature. Donald Haas, he argues that really we should inspire children to their imagination to write their own versions of fairy tales. And we find a lot of people, like I said, Annie Sexton was one poet, Marge Piercy, the one I talked about in class about, courtship was the word I couldn't think of. Courtship turns princes into frogs, and marriage turns them back into frogs into princes, and then marriage turns princes back into frogs. So, but children should be able to write their own version, and he doesn't. Therefore, Donald Haas argues or doesn't agree when someone like W.H. Auden, a great poet, but said that they're sacred and they should be untrampled, or that they belong to specific nations. Remember, he's right down in the middle, basically where we want to be, and seeing, so we can appreciate all the different versions of these tales. Now, Hansel and Gretel, I remember at the story's conclusion, Daddy's there, the stepmother has died, father's forgiven, but I like in the idea of nature is often on the side of goodness. So on their way back, remember, a duck helps the children on their way home, pretty much the way in the Disney versions the cute little bluebirds help make Cinderella's gown. She's connected with nature and is replaced where she should be at the end. Now, I haven't talked about this one in class, and I want you to make sure you read it, because we will talk about it, is Jane Yolen's The Lady in the Mermaid and the Mermaid. Now, the Born is the name. The girl's name is Born, and she wants nothing but her father's love, which she never gets. But the name means burden, and she's a burden to the father, and mainly because she's not beautiful. She actually kind of looks like him. But you want to read that because In many other ways, she's very much like Beauty in Beauty and the Beast. She helps with the community. She does all these things, but because she lacks beauty, no man finds her interesting. So in the end, she dives into the sea with the merman, without any indicator of why it. We'll talk about why would she do that. What is compelling her in society if the fisherman father is a symbol for, if you talk about patriarchy, what room is there for burden in the society that would make her commit suicide, perhaps, or jump in because the merman just treats her better. We'll talk about that. Now, we didn't, and I would like you to make sure to read Jack and the Devil. It's kind of like the story, what is the fiddling one? The Daniels band, where they're talking about the guy who takes on and challenges the devil to play the fiddle. And there's another one, famous one too. I'm trying to remember the name. It's an American Story where someone challenges the devil. The real famous one is the most written about short story in American literature, is the one by Nathaniel Hawthorne, Young Goodman Brown, where someone makes a bargain with the devil. And in this case, we have a black fairy tale from the South, and the author, Jules Lester, is taking these stories, and they were oral stories. Jack tales are very popular, and Jack and the Devil's Daughter. And he's changing them to make them contemporary, but he's also in the background. Notice is that eventually Jack and Beulah is the devil's daughter, who takes pity on Jack, and Jack's smart enough to know that the woman is very strong. They move to Harlem, where Jack continues in his brother owns grocery stores and law abiding, but Jack isn't. Jack is still wild, kind of on the wild side. He has bling, and he runs numbers, and he's always going to be who Jack is. But you notice that to get freedom and everything, they don't stay in the South. They move to Harlem, the home of the Harlem Renaissance later on. But that's Julius Lester has been very good with these kinds of things, and we'll read another story by him. Now, the other one we have talked about is the Paperback Princess, and Elizabeth doesn't use her beauty to dazzle and defeat the dragon and rescue Roland, her prince. She uses what's available to her. And she turns the usual might is right that the dragon has. Remember, we saw the reluctant dragon. That Elizabeth uses her brains to undermine the ferocious testosterone motivated dragon who likes to fly fast and burn things. And again, we go back then to I wanted to mention something more, a couple of things more about Beauty and the Beast. And one other thing about Jack. Remember, he relies on his trickster skills to undermine the devil's plan and win the hand of the devil's daughter. He relies on his skills, but he also is smart enough to know that Beulah can help him. It is true that he does rely on those plans, but they don't really work that well. And in the end, he incorporates Beulah's help into doing it because his trickster skills are not sufficient to overcome the devil's power. The devil's daughter turns against him. There's no question about that. Now, and a couple times things getting back to a little bit with Beauty and the Beast. In Beaumont's Beauty and the Beast, we have two sisters who are hardly supportive of of their youngest sister. Remember, she won't get married until the other two, and Dad needs help, and she sacrifices all this happiness. She thinks it's all sacrifice and sacrifice until she gets the payoff. And it's like in the end of Cinderella. Remember in the Perrault version, if you ever read it, Cinderella marries her stepsisters off, and enriches the family. But in Beauty and the Beast, the two sisters, not only are they not supportive of their younger sister, they manipulate her naivete into thinking, for example, that they really want her to stay past the time allotted by the giant for Beauty to visit her father in particular. What do you do with them at the end? In the end of the Perrault of Cinderella, as I said, they're married off, but in the Grimm version, they get their eyes plucked out by birds. There's a lesson for you. And here, the two daughters are turned into statues, but they can still think, and they're given a chance at redemption. But the idea is that they're going to be statues for a long time. Again, the in Beauty and the Beast, we find that the father is not an aristocrat. He's a merchant. And so at one point he loses his money and things along those lines. But he is a merchant. He gets into all kinds of trouble by trying to get a rose for his beauty, and ends up at the beast's castle, and has to sacrifice, and of course she'll sacrifice. The things change in fairy tales. I wanted to bring that up because you're reading some that do change, especially ones like Lady and the Mermaid, and also Paperback Princess. Any number of these modern versions of fairy tales that question the social conventions, as opposed to upholding established middle class values. The 70s, second flowering of children's literature, and we see that especially after the 60s, when the dropping out and all these things, there were a lot of questions about middle class and other values, and the fairy tales, the modern ones such as Lady and the Mermaid, begin to question the legitimacy of those, and wondering if maybe change should come about. Without a lot of times, like in the Lady and the Mermaid, you'll see that the outcome of the future is not really certain. And in the Paperback Princess, she tells Ralph, we're not going to get married. Well, what happens to her? And there's this. So she didn't marry, then what? And it leaves things up in the air, and in a question. Now, you did start your novel, at least I told you to start your novel, which is Skeleton Man. Now, Skeleton Man is narrated by a little girl, young lady, an intrepid girl, Molly, the unsinkable Molly Brown. Molly is in the 6th grade, and she's she's in class with Ms. Shabbos, who she likes, but who embarrasses the students. The students in Molly's class call her Ms. Showbiz, because she's always she's always singing songs from big past, mostly Broadway hits. But she's going to be a friend. She's a good friend to Molly, and I think the idea here is what you're going to find is that Molly will take from both traditions. So there is the unsinkable Molly Brown, about someone who should be intrepid in the face of big challenges, and so that's part of what happens there. But there's also the other side of the tradition, which is her American Indian side, and in that one, she sings a song when she discovers that her parents are gone. Of course, she's worried. She sings a song her mother taught her called the Lonesome Song, as another way of sort of trying to provide some protection and stamina, if you will. So she's taking for from both traditions, such as in the aware dreams that she has. And her mother told her about the dream, but in her aware dream, the idea is there's a certain real reality there. And in that one, a rabbit tells Molly that the one she thinks is her uncle is not human. He is the skeleton man. He is evil. And the skeleton man, nobody will believe her, of course, except the school teacher. But look in there at the fun, because she says, well, who would believe us? A little girl, sixth grader, all these adults think they know everything. Um, in Skeleton Man, in each morning, you see Molly is becoming more circumspect because the stories from her tradition are also teaching her about the evil, and in her dreams, the story comes true about the rabbit, and that changes the story too. The antisocial skeleton man is self-consuming uh, to the point of destroying family and all these other things, and she's the girl who, with the help of nature, is able to escape. And so in this particular one, though, it's like Hansel and Gretel in a way. She pretends to eat the meal the uncle prepared for her because she thinks that he's drugging her. So she's aware now. No one will believe her, and she has to sort of figure out a way to contend with evil. And we'll pick up the story after we finish our movie on Tuesday. We're towards the last part where everything becomes fun, uh, as you'll see. All right, do a good job on the quiz. I'll have it up for you in just